All right, we're back on the record on State versus Loyd. He's present with his attorney. State Attorney's Office is present. Let's bring the jury back in. State recognized presence of the jury.
We do, Your Honor.
Defense? Yes. All right, welcome back. I hope your lunch, although quick, was good.
Yes, ma'am.
Great. Defense is ready to resume their presentation. Mr. Lenneman, you may call your next witness.
Dr. Jethrow Toomer.
They didn't need it.
Oh,
They didn't need it.
good.
Should we?
I thought they were going to hit me up for it.
There he is.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to help you God?
Yes.
Have a seat, Doctor. You may inquire.
Thank you. Doctor, you can take your mask off completely. Sir, would you introduce yourself to the jury?
Yes, my name is Jethrow, Jethro, Toomer, Toomer.
Okay, and what do you do, Dr. Toomer?
I'm engaged in the, I'm engaged in the private practice of clinical and forensic psychology.
And how long have you been doing that?
Doctor, can you pull that mic closer to your mouth? The audio in here is very bad, so you have to be close to the mic. Right, thank you.
Is that better?
Much better,
Yes.
thank you.
Okay. I'm engaged in the private practice of clinical and forensic psychology.
And how long have you been doing that?
I've been doing that for over 25 years.
Okay, can you give the jury an overview of your qualifications?
I have a bachelor's, a master's and PhD degree in psychology. I am a diplomate of the American Board of Professional Psychology, which is the highest level of achievement in the field. I believe it was 2010, I retired from Florida International University. I was a tenured full professor, and I directed the graduate training program in mental health. And I've been engaged in as I said, in the private practice of clinical and forensic psychology. I'm also treatment consultant for the National Football League and for the National Basketball Association.
Okay. Did there come an occasion when you...
Excuse me, Mr. Lamb, do you need some water?
Yes,
Doctor?
could I get some water?
Yeah, we'll get you some water.
Thank you
Thanks.
very much.
Go ahead. We're just going to get him some water, but you can ask him between. Thanks.
Did there come an occasion when you were contacted by me to participate in some evaluations concerning Markeith Loyd?
Yes.
Do you remember approximately when that was?
That was sometime during 2019. I don't recall the exact date, but it was in 2019.
And were you provided multiple documents and materials?
Yes, I was.
Okay. And did you evaluate him in person?
Yes, I did. I saw him on two separate occasions.
Okay. And how long did you spend with him?
Oh, I would say probably a total of about 6 hours.
Okay. And what was the purpose of you evaluating him?
Well, the purpose of the evaluation was to render an opinion with regard to Mr. Loyd's, whether Mr. Loyd met the criteria, sanity versus insanity, at the time of the commission of the crime,
right.
which was the death of Lieutenant Clayton.
And can you explain what the criteria is?
Yes. In conducting an evaluation, in order to render an opinion, psychology requires that there are 4 basic components, processes that must be undertaken. One, obviously, is that of a face-to-face clinical assessment of the individual. The other involves testing, testing where appropriate. The third involves, thank you very much. The third involves deriving information from informants, individuals who've had contact with the person, with the client, during his or her developmental years. And fourth, the fourth component is utilizing or reviewing any collateral data, such as whether there were hospital records, prior evaluations, or what have you. And the corroboration of those sources of data is what yields the final opinion with regard to what you are addressing.
Okay. And can you address the issue and the importance of culture
Yes.
on this evaluative process?
That's correct. The whole issue, as I mentioned, one of the first components is the face-to-face assessment. The reason for the face-to-face clinical assessment is to assess, first of all, the individual's functioning. So, and as part of that process, what I'm doing is I'm looking at the individual's emotional functioning, I'm looking at the individual's cognitive functioning, I'm looking at the individual's behavioral functioning, and I'm also trying to get a feel for how the individual normally functions in terms of his adaptive capacity. In other words, I'm looking at, I'm listening to what the person says, I'm listening to what the person doesn't say, I'm listening to whether or not the individual is logical and or irrational in terms of his or her presentation. I'm also looking at what the individual avoids. I look at whether the individual is what we call involved in perseveration, where the individual deals with and addresses the same topic over and over again. I'm looking at all of these kinds of factors as part of the clinical assessment. So basically, I am looking at and trying to get a feel for how the individual is functioning and how the individual is relating in terms of his ability to interact and the individual's thought processes, reasoning processes. I'm looking at all those kinds of things as part of the clinical assessment. The testing basically attempts to provide data with regard to how the individual is functioning. And in this particular case, I'm looking at whether or not, trying to get a feel for whether or not the person is malingering. And when I say malingering, I'm talking about, excuse me, I'm talking about the person's attempts to fake that they may be suffering from some type of mental illness or some type of mental disability or what have you. Malingering is what it's called. So the testing is designed to get a feel for whether or not the person is likely malingering. The other test that I gave was designed to get a feel for the individual's overall functioning as it relates to his environment, his culture. And that is because a big component in terms of the evaluation process involves culture. In fact, just this past week, the American Psychological Association has submitted an international...
Objection, hearsay, bolstering.
Sustained.
Okay, doctors, has there been information generated that talk about culture?
Yes. Culture has been a critical piece in terms of the psychological dynamic of evaluation for well over 20 years or so. In fact, the American Psychological Association, I believe it may have been around 1990, published a separate document.
Sustained.
And so why is culture important?
Objection, asked and answered.
He didn't answer.
Overruled. You can answer that one.
Why is culture important?
Culture is important because the dynamic changes. And when I say the dynamic changes, I mean what may be appropriate in one culture may not be in another. And it may be, and you may oftentimes have situations where a person who is designated to render an opinion applies inappropriately his or her cultural orientation to someone where it is not appropriate. And so that's why the cultural phenomena is critical and important in terms of rendering an opinion with regard to someone's functioning. May I give an example?
Sure.
For example, if someone goes to see an individual psychologist and is being evaluated, and that person says, I carry a gun because I'm afraid somebody might hurt me or be after me, the temptation is to say, from a perspective of a helper, the temptation is to say, well, the person's paranoid. But according to psychology and the dynamics of evaluation, it's not paranoia. if it is consistent with and it is a protective factor in the culture and environment in which a person lives. So if a person lives in a dangerous environment or what have you, that behavior is very practical. It's not significant, it's not representative of anything, anything that is psychologically deviant. And so that's how oftentimes how culture can be utilized against an individual, and it leads, and the problem is that it leads to the wrong conclusion. It leads to the wrong conclusion in terms of the opinion that the examiner is trying to make.
Now, what is the DSM-5?
The DSM-5 is the standard, if you will, in the field of psychology that addresses the diagnosis of mental illness. It provides an overview of the dynamic of diagnosis, the diagnostic process with respect to mental illness.
And do you find the DSM-5 an authority?
Yes, the DSM-5 is an authority. The only caveat is that you have to have clinical training in order to be able to utilize the DSM-5.
Okay. And in the DSM-5, is there references made to culture under these diagnoses?
Yes, throughout. It references pretty much what I have just said, and that is that you have to take into account culture. If you don't take into account culture, it may oftentimes, and oftentimes does, lead to misdiagnosis. At the university, we incorporated that into our training program, into our entire training program, and that's pretty much the accepted standard across the country.
Now, you mentioned earlier a malingering test that you gave Mr. Loyd.
Yes.
Why is it important to give a malingering test?
Well, we are always concerned, and we always want to rule out whether or not an individual is faking. In other words, whether an individual is trying to, in some way, present as if he or she is suffering from some underlying mental illness or mental disorder or what have you that affects their functioning.
Now, you mentioned some of the material you reviewed. Did you have an opportunity to review the Facebook pages of Mr. Loyd?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Did you review all of them?
Yes.
Okay. And did you take that into consideration in your evaluated process?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Can you tell the jury what anosognosia is?
Yes. Anosognosia is an offshoot, if you will. It's a subcategory of schizophrenia, and it describes a component of schizophrenia which is characterized by a lack of insight and a lack of rationality and judgment that is part of that particular dynamic. We're talking about schizophrenia now. So this is a component of schizophrenia, and it's oftentimes a characteristic, a symptom that is manifested by individuals who are suffering from some form of schizophrenia.
Do other forms of mental illness attach to the anosognosia besides schizophrenia?
I'm sorry, you repeat that again, please?
Besides schizophrenia, what other illnesses attach or are connected to anosognosia?
Oh, you can find some of the same symptomatology manifested in other forms of mental illness, such as bipolar disorder and the like.
And what does that mean? What is anosognosia?
It is a lack of insight, a lack of judgment that attends to schizophrenia. And when we talk about schizophrenia, we often talk about it in terms of schizophrenia spectrum disorder. And that means that with schizophrenia, you can have a variety of symptoms manifested that fall under that particular category.
Okay, and does that mean if you have anosognosia that you don't recognize that you're mentally ill?
Yes, the other component with regard to that is that they're with schizophrenia, schizophrenia spectrum disorder. What you have oftentimes is a lack of recognition. This goes back to the point of insight, a lack of recognition of mental illness, a lack of recognition of irrationality, and a lack of judgment in terms of how the symptomatology unfolds and manifests itself.
And does Markeith Loyd have that?
Yes, he does.
You're aware that he does not believe he's mentally ill?
That is correct, yes.
Now I want to talk about what is the purpose of your evaluation?
The purpose of the evaluation was to render an opinion as to whether Mr. Loyd was insane at the time of the commission of a crime.
And what are the steps that you take in the process?
As I mentioned, in that process, there are those 4 components that I just mentioned early on. In addition to that, what we do, because in psychology, we are required to render an opinion based upon the totality of the data. So in addition, while the focus is on the particular day in time and his actions on that particular day, as a psychologist, I am bound ethically, pedagogically, and otherwise to look at the totality of the data to see if the totality of the data comports with, or how the totality of the data comports with action on that particular day. So in order to do that, I start with, as I mentioned, one of those earlier components, and that is I talk to people who have known the individual for a significant portion of his or her, in this case, Mr. Loyd, his developmental history. And so in doing so, what I am trying to see is what has been the pattern of behavior, of development, of learning, of growth with this particular individual leading up to the particular point or time in question.
And what information, give the jury an example of some of the information that you used and received.
Well, I talked by phone to family members, and I also reviewed various tapes from testimony that had been provided by family members. And they were all consistent in describing a very troubled and tumultuous developmental history on the part of the individual and his sibling and family.
Did you have an opportunity to review the transcripts of experts from the first case?
Yes. Yes, I did.
Okay. And did you rely in some form on their opinions as well?
Yes, I did. I relied on their opinion in terms of that being part of another component that I just mentioned, and that was the collateral data. So
Okay.
that was relied upon also.
Did you have an opportunity to, during your 6 hours of interview, talk to Mr. Loyd?
Yes, I did.
Okay. What kind of, when you say the information from his childhood,
Yes.
can you give us an example?
Yes. Mr. Loyd experienced a number of factors that we refer to as adverse. In other words, from a psychological perspective, an individual, in terms of growing and developing normally, needs several basic factors, operative. The person needs predictability, sameness, safety, and structure. Within that context, the person grows and develops normally. The brain grows and develops normally. When those factors, and these are the factors that were not present in Mr. Loyd's history, when those factors are absent, the individual grows and continues to grow chronologically, but cognitively, behaviorally, and emotionally remains fixated at a much younger chronological age. It's only within that context of safety, predictability, and sameness is the individual able to grow and to develop a pattern of behavior that is consistent over time. If you have all of these, what we call destabilizers, then it precludes the individual developing a pattern of consistent thought and behavior. And in Mr. Loyd's case, there was domestic violence. His mother related an instance where she and his father were having an argument, and he was an infant, very less than an infant.
Objection, hearsay.
Sustained.
All right, so you obtained a bunch of information
Yes.
from family members,
Yes,
and you factored that into your evaluated process.
right, factors regarding the tumultuous nature of the history of the
Okay, did you have an opportunity to speak with Mr. Loyd?
Yes, I did.
Did you speak with him about events leading up to the death of Lieutenant Clayton?
Yes, I did.
Okay, and what did you speak to him about?
I spoke to him about a significant portion of his history and functioning leading up to that particular time. And he had had issues with the police. He had been wrongfully charged with regard to a particular incident that had occurred. He had experienced a number of losses in terms of close individuals who had died. He had himself been injured. He had been robbed. So there were all kinds of tumultuous incidents going on in his life at that particular point in time. And over time, he had developed as a result his perspective with regard to his position in society and in his structural framework.
Now, in preparing for your ultimate decision in this case, you obviously reviewed these Facebook pages that were written, and tell us about what you saw in those.
Well, in the Facebook pages, what you see are sort of classic examples of schizophrenia. Sometimes you see that in individuals who are suffering from bipolar disorder and in other mental illnesses. But you have a kind of dysfunctional component in terms of what is rational, what is related to ongoing structural functioning. You can have a kind of disconnect with reality. And so you have these kinds of factors that you see being manifested in terms of the individual's descriptions of what is going on. You also see signs of paranoia. You see signs of a reality orientation that does not take into account context or what have you. So you have this kind of disjointed process in terms of communication and in terms of interaction.
Now, one of the diagnosis that you came to was that Mr. Loyd suffered from delusions?
Yes, he did.
Could you tell the jury what a delusion is?
A delusion is a fixed set of beliefs in spite of evidence to the contrary. And when you talk about delusions can come from a number of different places. Delusions can come from repeated traumatic events. Delusions can come from head trauma. Delusions can occur as a result of, delusions can be characteristic of a number of different mental illnesses. But with regard to Mr. Loyd, it's related to the diagnosis of schizophrenia, and also with respect to other deficits that he's manifested.
And Dr. Toomer, did you see delusional thinking throughout his Facebook memorandums or communications?
Yes, I did. Delusional and paranoid.
I'm going to show you what's part of defendant's exhibit number 17. I want you to take, this is part of, I want you to take a moment just to read this, and then I'm going to ask you some questions. Did you read it?
Yes.
Okay. So in relating to just this particular Facebook entry, tell me how a false fixed belief becomes part of this.
Well, the fixed belief that you have is related to the notion that he and black people basically are designed to be the subject of punishment, harassment, and degradation by white society.
Okay, and do you see that throughout his Facebook pages?
Yes, that's manifested throughout, with some religious ideosity thrown in as part of the justification with respect.
And can you explain why that is a fixed false belief in comparison to someone who has maybe feelings that there is prejudice and racism? Can you explain that?
Right, because as I indicated earlier, context. An individual who is functioning normally is able to take things and put them in what we call context with respect to how they are viewed, the value given. When you're mentally ill, you are not able. Things are not placed in context. The world is viewed through your delusional system. So whatever it is that you believe that is part of that system, that is the filter, if you will, through which the world is viewed. And nothing else matters, because that particular delusion is fixed. And so that is what you see happening, and what you see manifested in his writings, whether they were Facebook or whether they were other generated writings that has been manifested. And it's critical, because this has gone on for years. It's not just something that's recent.
All right, I want to put this as a state's exhibit, and I want you to read that one there, which is I have no sympathy. And when you're done, let me know. Mm-hmm. Okay, so tell me how this is related to a delusional thinking process with a fixed false belief.
Well, once again, you have the same overarching dynamic in terms of what is fueling this particular thought process. In other words, the idea is that blacks have been maligned by whites, that continues to be the situation. Blacks are killed repeatedly, nothing gets done, nothing gets done about it. That there are people who are black who don't do anything about it and are in essence afraid to do anything about it. And in essence, he's not one of them. And the idea is that nobody says what needs to be said with regard to what happens. And so that fixed, once again, you see that fixed system is how the world is viewed.
Now, between July of 2014 and December of 2016, you're aware that Mr. Loyd was working numerous jobs and...
I am, yes.
Okay. These are the same times he's posting these.
That's correct.
How do you explain that someone to the exterior world is a hard worker, so forth and so on, but is constantly caught up in this?
Because it's important to understand that, and this runs counter, I think, to conventional thought. It's important to understand that what you have just asked and what you have just described occurs with great regularity, because outward behavior is not always a reflection of inner motivation. So because someone is able to go from point A to point B doesn't mean that they are functioning internally as we think they should be. I don't know if I can give an example, but sure. I think the best way to think about this is if I were to ask the question, why do we laugh? And most people would say, well, that's a crazy question to ask. When you say, why do we laugh because something is funny. And nothing could be further from the truth. Most laughter is tension release. Think about how many times you laughed at the boss's jokes when they weren't funny. How many times did you go somewhere where you didn't want to go and you didn't want to meet anybody there or what have you, but you went anyway because you were forced or you felt guilty or what have you. And so you go there, and when you meet somebody or you see somebody, what do? You smile, you laugh. Somebody watching you from over there looks and says, yes, I saw him or her, and guess what? They had a great time. They were smiling and laughing. So inner motivation is not always accounted for by outward behavior. And that's related to an old adage in psychology and psychiatry that says that which is most obvious is not always true. And that is what you have in this particular case.
Now, how do you explain that Mr. Loyd was never given any kind of medication throughout his adult life? And let's leave the adult life beginning at 2014 of July to December of 2016, yet he was still having this internal thinking.
That's part of that, what we alluded to earlier. You don't trust what is going on around you, so you wouldn't trust a regimen of medication. That could be part of the overall dynamic fed through the delusional system that we have just addressed. And so as a result, you would not have that kind of contextual approach to that behavior that you might have otherwise in that situation.
Okay. Did there come a time when you spoke to Mr. Loyd about the events, and I think we talked about leading up to Clayton?
Yes.
Did you have a conversation with him?
Yes, I did.
What was important, and what was the important part of the conversation that you believe you had with him?
The important part of the conversation was the fact that his delusional system was so entrenched, so rigid, and so structured as to defy any alternate explanation.
Okay. And when you were talking with him, would he go from a low voice into a louder voice where he is saying some of the same things that he says in his Facebook?
Throughout the evaluation, there was not what you would call an even flow in terms of his clinical presentation. There was this vacillation in terms of the unevenness in terms of emotionality, and it would differ depending upon what was taking place in terms of discussion. For example, we might be talking about a particular subject that may not have anything to do, maybe, I think one time we briefly discussed sports or something like that. But at other times, for example, I remember the first time I visited him, he began with Trayvon Martin, and he was able to list almost from memory every single black person who had ever been killed in any kind of confrontation with police in the United States. And when he would get to that and get into all of this listing, and he would start talking about, he would become, his mood would become elevated, he would become slightly agitated, a little grandiose, expansive in terms of this, but the mood would completely change from one end of the continuum to the other. And whenever he would talk about transgressions, whenever he would talk about the Dixon case, he would talk about the time that he was falsely accused. He would talk about all of these things, and his mood would change and would vary, would become elevated in terms of how he would present. And so you did have this unevenness across the psychological continuum or the emotional continuum as part of the evaluation.
And as part of that, when you went to see him, did he verbalize to you, when he was talking about the Dixon case, my failures, things that I didn't do right as an attorney?
Yes.
And was that pretty much a theme every time you went to see him?
Yes. He would talk about the wrongs that had been committed. People were not doing anything about it. He talked about his mother.
Narrative, John.
Sustained.
Okay. So when he was talking about that with you, what would he talk about specifically?
He would talk about his mother trying to lead him to worship a God that white people had given her. He would talk about Christmas, New Year's, Thanksgiving being pagan holidays that had been given to black people by white America. He would talk, that was sort of the nature of what he would present in terms of describing his situation to me.
And did you come to find out at some point in your interview that at a very young age he started watching movies that involved race?
Yes. He mentioned to me that he had the movie Roots had a significant impact on him, and also Mississippi Burning had an impact on him.
When you're saying impact, what are you talking about?
He would become agitated. He would speak to the egregious nature of the suffering by black people at the hands of white people, and it was spelled out in Roots in one context, and in Mississippi Burning in another.
Okay.
And so he saw that basically as, in essence, what he had been talking about, as proof of what he had been talking about and what he had been saying all along in terms of his belief system.
Now, in looking at that, like that particular movie, Roots, in terms of his false fixed belief, how would you describe his false fixed belief to someone who is just watching Roots normally? They don't have a false fixed belief.
Well, what happens is that when you are mentally ill, you do not process information in the same way as someone who is not. As we mentioned before when we talked about schizophrenia, another component of schizophrenia is called a thought process disorder. And so the thought process disorder is the basis as to why, is part of the basis as to why you have those kinds of issues in terms of how a person might interpret a particular circumstance, a particular set of circumstances, or what have you. And so that is what takes place and what goes on, and that's what you have with Mr. Loyd. If you have someone who is quote unquote rational, if you will, then what happens is that is taken in context with respect to what is actually going on now, with respect to your own reality. And then there is a determination made as to how one will cope and how one will proceed given those particular set of circumstances. When you do not have that, when you are mentally ill or suffering the effects of a mental illness, that context is gone. There is no context. The only context is your fixed delusional system. And that context, we're talking here about a fixed delusional system. But for some people, that context is extreme paranoia. For some people, that context may be severe depression. So it manifests itself in different ways depending upon the circumstance at a particular point in time.
And what did you see manifested in Mr. Loyd's?
I saw in terms of his, in terms of how he manifests, how his behaviors manifested, his thoughts are manifested. I saw the symptomatology of a major mental illness, characterizing what he said, what he believed, and its position in his whole thought process.
Okay, now, did there come a time when you talked to him about the actual events involving the shooting of Lieutenant Clayton?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Can you tell us what was important in that conversation?
In that conversation, what was important was as he described as he described what transpired. The predominant theme was that they're going to kill me. And that predominant theme apparently carried over and was accentuated by the fact that he said to me, you see, I told them that I was willing to turn myself in, and they, instead of giving me the opportunity to do that, they're going to kill me. And that to him was proof that they were out to kill him. And that's how everything filtered through him at that particular point, through his thought process at that particular point in time. Was it your understanding that he had an ongoing belief for some time that the police were trying to kill him? Oh, for quite some time, yes.
Okay. So I want to talk about now an event that you mentioned with the newspaper and turning himself in, I think. Are there times when people have fixed false beliefs that there are things that cause that mental illness, stressors, events, circumstances to multiply, to get more serious than what normally it is?
Sure, that happens. That you can have events that tend to exacerbate the severity of the underlying mental illness. And so, and what happens also is that you can have events, and the person who is mentally ill will take a piece of the event. Doesn't have to have the whole event, but may take a piece of the event, and that also will exacerbate the severity of the mental illness that the individual is manifesting, or the symptomatology of the mental illness that is being manifested. So for Mr. Loyd, the issue was that he could have turned himself in, and he would have been willing to turn himself in if the media told the truth. And so with that alone, that was enough to continue to exacerbate his belief and his fixed delusional system that they were out to kill him.
Okay, and can you explain how that specifically played a role? I know you said that he said the police wanted to kill him or were going to kill him. Can you go through specifically what he told you about the event that occurred with Lieutenant Clayton?
He mentioned to me that on a particular day, he was in the Walmart store. He had been on the run from the police, and he was in the Walmart store because he was extremely hungry and hadn't had anything to eat or what have you. And he was in the Walmart store on that particular day. He said that he recognized, or he saw the police uniform, but he recognized that it was a police, and an individual from the police department who was there. And so
Where?
At the Walmart, in the checkout line.
Okay.
At the Walmart in the checkout line. And so he attempted to move so as not to be seen in that, as part of that, what was going on there at that particular point in time, so he could get there, get out, and go on about his business. At some point upon leaving, he was recognized, and I believe there was a Miss Bryant.
Okay, so you're getting some of this information from reports and depositions and things like that?
Yes.
I
Yes.
want you to stay focused on what he's telling you about the event as it's transpiring.
Okay, I mentioned that because he said that evidently at some point he was recognized or whatever. I don't recall exactly, but at some point he was recognized. And upon being recognized and upon leaving the store with a cart, he was approached by Lieutenant Clayton. And when he was approached by Lieutenant Clayton, he used his cart to try to distract her or to act as a buffer between he and the lieutenant. And as he attempted to run away, he, for a moment, took refuge behind a pillar of sorts, of something that was there. And he heard a shot. He believed that he was being fired upon, and he in turn returned fire, and then attempted to make his escape because he believed that he was being pursued at that particular point in time.
Okay, so I want to go back to the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
You used Miss Bryan, you used Lieutenant Clayton,
Yes.
their name.
Mm-hmm.
Did you decipher from him whether he was talking about facts he knows now versus facts he knew then?
With Miss Bryant, I only mentioned Miss Bryant because when he said to me that he was recognized, it triggered that Miss Bryant's, when I read her transcript, she indicated that she recognized him. So
Right.
He didn't mention her name.
Okay,
You know,
I
he
just
didn't-
I want to make sure we stay with what he says is happening.
Yes.
So he never said anything about Miss Bryant?
No, he never said anything.
Okay.
I made
Okay.
that transition.
So when he goes out the front door,
Yes.
what happens?
He goes out the front door, and that's when he recognizes that's when he believes that he has been recognized or that he has been seen or what have you, and that the officer, Lieutenant Clayton, recognized him, and that's when he pushed the cart in terms of trying to create a buffer.
Now, did you actually view the video?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And did you see when he goes out the front door, as soon as he goes out the front door, he walks a few feet and then he breaks left?
Yes.
Okay. And what happens when he breaks left?
As he starts to move, he...
To clarify who he's referring to.
What happens when Mr. Loyd breaks left?
He breaks left the...
Sustained. Rephrase?
What happens when he, what does he do next?
He begins to
Same
move.
objection, Your Honor.
Let me see the attorneys at the bench, please. You may proceed.
Doctor,
Yes.
I want to talk to you about only what Mr. Loyd talked to you about, not what was in any of the transcripts or anything like that.
Yes.
You read, he read, whatever, only what he's saying to you, okay?
Yes.
Okay, so what does he say after he goes through that door? Happen?
He goes through the door. He sees police and believe Officer Lieutenant Clayton, that he has been recognized.
He doesn't know this is Lieutenant Clayton.
He doesn't know.
Okay, so let's stick with what he is telling you specifically.
Okay. That he sees police.
Okay, and what happens?
And he believes he has been recognized. And he begins to move in a direction to get away from that, from being recognized, to get out of, as I indicated earlier, he wanted to get whatever he got, get out of Walmart and move on.
Okay.
And in doing so, he believes that he is shot at, and he hears a shot, and as he is fleeing, if for want of a better term, he shoots, and that is what he recalled in terms of what transpired.
Okay. Did he tell you when he had pulled his gun out?
I beg your pardon?
Did he tell you when he had pulled his gun out?
No, he did not.
So what he said was that when he was fleeing, he was shot at, and that's when he returned fire.
That's correct, yes.
Is there anything else that's important about that event to you that you used in the process of your evaluation?
I don't know if there's anything additional except that all of his actions and his description of those appear to be fueled by a belief that he was going to be killed, that he was in fear for his life.
Now, we've talked about that you've had these conversations with him, right?
Yes.
Okay. And that you've actually talked to family members and you reviewed evidence.
Yes.
Now, can you explain what each step contributes to the process
Yes.
of rendering an opinion?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that again?
Can you explain what each step contributes to the process and rendering of an opinion?
Yes.
Been previously testified to.
No, I'm going to allow this question. Go ahead.
You understand the question, Doctor?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Each step of the process brings something to the evaluation, because each step of the process, if you consider this as being the process, it leads to the conclusion. The conclusion of the opinion is based upon the totality of the data gathered from the process. And each step of the process adds something. As we mentioned, the clinical assessment, which involves a consideration of culture, provides information regarding the person's functioning, both his functioning, intellectual, cognitive, behavioral, emotional functioning. It also provides information regarding the person's culture, which allows us to, or the examiner, to, in essence, make sure that the opinions that are reached within the certainty of a cultural context and not in an imposed, and not based upon an imposed set of constructs. So we get that picture of his cognitive, behavioral, emotional functioning from the clinical assessment. The testing component is designed, in this particular case, to assess the issue of malingering, faking, if you will, and also to get some other information regarding the individual's overall background with respect to developmental history. The other component, the next component with regard to informants, we try to talk to individuals who have known the person in question throughout his or her lifetime. So we try to get information from people, and hopefully that will be, those individuals are the closest individuals to the particular family member, you know, sisters, brothers, parents, what have you. And then we also try to look at and gather information derived from collateral sources. And that's what we alluded to earlier when we talk about looking at what opinions have been reached, what the test results show. When Mr. Loyd was examined earlier by a number of experts who have provided opinions regarding his overall psychological functioning or psychological dysfunctioning. And what you're trying to do here is you're looking at the totality of the data, because as I indicated earlier, we can't just look at a particular point in time. We have to look at the totality of the data, because what we're trying to see is whether or not are we talking about something that just started the day before the event, or are we talking about something that has existed for some time? So these are the kinds of questions that we are able to answer in terms of rendering an opinion at the end with regard to whether or not a person is considered to be sane or insane related to a specific action. And so the totality of the data and the corroboration amongst the sources of the data is what is critical from a psychological perspective with regard to what is transpired.
Okay, based on all of your interaction with Mr. Loyd, your review of records, your meetings with family members, and everything else that you reviewed, did you come up with a diagnosis for Mr. Loyd?
Yes.
Can you tell the jury what that diagnosis is?
Well, there were several diagnoses. If we want to talk about an overriding diagnosis, but there are several. Schizophrenia is one. Bipolar disorder is another. Post-traumatic stress disorder is another. Psychosis is another. So there are these categories, and also based upon past evaluations, a provisional diagnosis of a neurocognitive disorder, i.e. brain damage, would be another that would be that would be considered as part of the diagnostic entity with regard to the mental illness that, from which he suffers.
And did you say post-traumatic stress?
Yes.
Now, after you concluded that, did you look at the insanity instruction and come to a conclusion?
Yes, I did.
Can you tell the jury what that is?
Well, the conclusion that I reached is that while Mr. Loyd knew what he was doing, he didn't know that it was wrong. The second prong he does not meet.
Okay, and then the first prong is?
He did not know what he was doing was the first.
No, I understand, but did he have a mental illness, disease, or defect?
Yes, the mental illness, disease, or defect was what I alluded to a little earlier in terms of what I found as a result of
So it's your opinion that he had a mental infirmity, disease, or defect, and because of this condition, although he knew what he was doing and its consequences, he did not know it was wrong.
Correct, yes.
And based on that, do you have an ultimate opinion yourself about whether Mr. Loyd was insane at the time of the shooting of Debra Clayton?
Yes, he was insane at the time of the shooting of Lieutenant Clayton.
That's all the questions I have, Judge.
All right, thank you, Mr. Norman. Cross.
Good afternoon, Dr.